Part 18. Has the stage been set for the return of the archons? Have the fallen watchers been released? Enoch 10:12. When their sons have slain one another and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations. Remember, we said that earlier. In the valleys of the earth until the time of judgment. Well, Psalm 90 verse 10 defines a generation as 70 years, 80 if by strength. Let's just go at 70. 70 times 70 is 4,900 years. 4,900 years away from 3000 BC, the timeline I showed you before, takes you to 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. And again, looking at the timeline chart, this is that time period right there. So going 4,900 years takes you to the beginning, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And I began to wonder, have the Watchers been released? If you look through the book of Enoch, you see that the Watchers were teaching men all kinds of stuff, basically forbidden sciences, and even abortion. Kazdaja, I think, was the angel's name that taught the art of abortion. All kinds of stuff that were taught that were wrong, that were taught to humans by the Watchers of the Genesis 6 experiment. Well, when you think about the prophecy in Daniel 12:4, it talks about people going to and fro and knowledge increasing. We see a massive increase in both transportation and knowledge from the, really the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. But you hit 1900, it's like, and it continues to go up. I mean, we went from beasts of burden, right, for 5,000 years, to all of a sudden planes, trains, automobile, all kinds of stuff in just a very short period of time. How did that happen? Unless we had help. Well, it's coincidentally, if you talk to some of these founders of like Lockheed Martin and some of these other organizations, NASA, and the Nazis that were brought over from Operation Paperclip, would say things like, we had help. And they'd be very vague about where they got that help from. Well, yeah, I think they did have help. Maybe the fallen ones have been released. You look at other characters like this. I mentioned this briefly earlier. Aleister Crowley. In January through March of 1918, famed occultist Aleister Crowley began a series of magical experiments called the Amelantra workings, in which he is said to have opened a portal to another dimension, allowing an entity, a demon named Lamb, to enter through it. In 1918, he drew a picture of this entity, and this is what he drew, which just so happens to coincidentally look very similar to the so-called modern grays of pop culture today. Interesting. And I mentioned earlier Jack Parsons, but I'll go a little bit deeper here. Supposedly, Crowley's portal was further enlarged by Jet Propulsion Laboratory founder and rocket fuel scientist Jack Parson and his Scientology and Dianetics founder L. Ron Hubbard in March of 1946 at a location that later became known as Area 51. Their experiment was called the Babylon working. Like the Amelantra working, it was based on ceremonial sex magic. Unlike Crowley, however, they were not as adept at opening and closing portals. Theirs apparently stayed open, and the modern UFO era began 1 year later in 1947, the same year Aleister Crowley died. So, was it the acts of characters like this that were bringing about some of these things? I don't know. I mean, we see that there's all kinds of blood sacrifices and rituals and stuff like that throughout the biblical narrative that God forbids his people from doing. Why? Because that's what was required of their ancient gods. They were worshiping demons and all kinds of stuff like that, opening up, all kinds of stuff in their own life back then. We see a massive increase in all that type of activity happening in the early 1900s, which just so happened to coincidentally be at the end of the time period of the judgment that was prescribed for the Watchers in the book of Enoch. So I began to speculate. It appears to me that they either have been released or are being released, maybe, sequentially over time, and that's why we are seeing things getting progressively worse and worse and worse in our day today. Alien abduction, is this a fulfillment of prophecy? I don't know. Daniel 2:43. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they, who are they, shall mix themselves with the seed of men. But they, who are they, shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. I don't know, just speculation, but if you start looking into this whole UFO phenomena, it's real. L.A. Marzulli is fond of saying it is real and burgeoning and not going away. It's a good statement. You start Googling it, and you'll start seeing more and more activity taking place all around the world. Something is happening. Something's going on up there. And with that activity in the sky, more and more alleged alien abduction cases are coming up where people, who, if they're even willing to share their experience, are talking about the horrific things that have happened to them. But again, it's all scientific experimentation. They're being taken forcefully from their homes and whatnot, going through various scientific experimentations, reproductive organs and stuff like that being tampered with, and all kinds of things are happening. Is that what Daniel's talking about? I don't know, but it just so happens to be happening at the same time that transportation and knowledge is increasing at the end of the time period of the Watchers. So again, is it just a coincidence that right around the same time the modern era of UFO and alien abduction activity begins, these ancient texts just so happen to be found? All this stuff starts ramping up in the 1940s. And then some kid throws a rock in a cave, cracks a jar, and out pops the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. In fact, if you read the first chapter of the first book of Enoch, First Enoch, it tells you specifically, this was not written for that generation, but for a remote future generation who will live in the day of tribulation. It's like the first chapter of the first book tells you this is not for today, it's for those who are living in the day of tribulation. So we all raised our hand earlier saying that, you know what, we think we could be living in the last days, which will conclude with the tribulation. So guess what? The book pops out for our time. Interesting.